Okay, so the first thing I want to ask you about is free speech in the UK. Do you personally believe that everybody should have the right to free speech?
I believe they should, but we don't. We live in a post-free speech era. Anyone who thinks they have free speech, the country I thought I lived in, post-2009, when I started my activism, is a very different country to the one I now accept we live in. Since talking about Islam, I've faced complete government persecution, police persecution, violent opposition, and that's all for expressing my free speech and criticism to an ideology.
Do you believe that everybody has the right to freedom of speech? So Anjem Choudhury, as an example, does he have the right to free speech?
I think everyone has the right to free speech. We have laws that we introduced in this country which were incitement to violence, incitement to hatred. So we already have laws that tackle people who want to incite murder or incite violence. So I don't think people should be inciting murder or violence. If Anjem Choudhury wants to talk about his views of Islam and without propagating and encouraging violence or murder, then he should be free to do so. But we have laws for that. But those laws aren't implemented across everyone equally. Basically, we have imams. We had a man yesterday convicted of making his dog do his pug dog. I don't know if you saw this case. He had a pug dog, and for a joke, he taught it to do a Nazi salute. He's been prosecuted. He faces prison in 4 weeks' time. We have preachers of hate. We have a rally for our capital city every year called RTUK. We have Hezbollah, terrorist organisation flags. They chant, kill the Jews, kill the Jews. That's real hate. They're not prosecuted, ever. In fact, Sadiq Khan, the mayor of our capital, goes on the same march. So the law has to be implemented across everyone equally. It's not. And that's what and people see that. Everyone can see it. I've had hundreds and hundreds of people threaten to murder my family, kill my kids. I've been violently attacked. Not one person has ever been prosecuted. Ever.
Never.
Never. No prosecution against anyone. I've been punched on the TV, and national TV, when the man who done that is now in jail for terrorism, but he wasn't arrested. So people see this. People see the unlevel playing field. And
why do you think that is? Why do you think when it's you, nobody is prosecuted?
Because the police would rather I shut up. The government would want me to shut up. They've been trying their hardest for 9 years or 10 years to silence what I'm saying, because they fear the reaction of what I say. And and all I do is speak the truth and speak openly and honestly about Islam. That's it.
The biggest criticism of yourself is that people will say that it crosses the border between free speech and hate speech.
Yes.
How do you feel about that? You are accused of hate speech over free speech.
This is my question for you then. I'd say you've researched me before coming on here. You've obviously had time to research into me. Did you find any hate speech? Did you find any quotes? Because all of the journalists, whenever I go anywhere, if I was promoting hate speech, they'd be throwing these accusations at me. They don't. They never can. In fact, everyone that's ever said it to me, I say, give me one example. Just give me one. By
promoting yourself as anti-Islam and openly saying, I am anti-Islam.
Would you say, you know, if I was anti-Scientology, would people say that's hate speech? Would that be deemed as racism? Basically, the word hate speech has taken over now from racism. What they used is the accusation of racism was to silence the public and silence the discourse, so they can control the discourse, they can control what's being said. They use racism, Nazi. They've absolutely destroyed those two terms. The true victims of racism now, it's an insult to the true victims of racism. It's an insult to the true victims of Nazi, that anyone with a different political ideology to people who read The Guardian is called a Nazi. That's what we're seeing. So with regards to hate speech, it's like I've had Yvonne Cooper, Fletcher? No, what's her name?
Yvette Cooper.
Yvette Cooper, who's an MP just this week, standing in front of CEOs from YouTube saying that I promote hate. I've seen Baroness Farsi this last week standing in Parliament saying that I promote hate. I've seen Mark Rowley, the head of counter-terrorism, saying that I promote hate. Not one of those people, and I know it, would be able to give me an example.
Mentioning police, how do the police treat you? Let's talk about the incident with Antifa in Wood Green, Haringey. How do you feel you are treated in terms of your right to free speech, and Antifa, are they treated differently to you?
I wouldn't have time to go through everything, but from the day I started opening my mouth, I've seen illegal raids, I've seen armed police come into my house and my children. They arrested my wife, who was 6 months pregnant at the time. They kept her on bail conditions for 4 years. They sat her through 3 8-hour interviews. They then arrested other members of my family, all fraudulently. They dropped them all under a deal that I'd plead guilty and go to prison. They took my assets, they froze my businesses, they held me on on laws that they brought in to tackle terrorism. They held me on, so I wasn't allowed to spend more than £250 a week for 4 years. When I started the English Defence League, I owned 7 properties, I had 2 successful businesses. They'd done everything they could to destroy that. So that's the free speech. That's the police. And then I've been approached by Met Intelligence Bureau, who are a secretive unit within Scotland Yard, who approached me in prison to work for them.
And what about when it comes to free speech? Do you feel like the police have an agenda against you to curtail your free speech?
They want to shut you up. That's exactly all this has been about. That's all it's ever been about.
And Antifa, are they treated differently?
Yep. So Antifa continually wear face masks and beat people up and attack people. What we've seen, this is the problem we have in the UK. People like myself have been targeted by them for 7, 8 years, 9 years. Yeah? What we now see, last week at King's College London, a liberal speaker and a Jewish speaker were attacked and their event was shut down. We see feminists. So this whole silencing and no platform has moved and shifted, and it's not good where it's gone. Do we have free speech? Are you open to talk? These groups work, and most of these groups the funding comes from government. You're not against fascism, government funded. Most of these groups are government funded. They're like the jackboots, who the government fund to silence and shut up anyone who goes against the status quo. Anyone they don't like, they find out where you live, they find out where you work, they dox you, and then in the end they issue violent threats. And they violently beat you. And most of these groups, there's another group out there working now called Resisting Hate, who work with Tell Mama. Tell Mama are government funded. The leader is a Muslim with an OBE. And their whole entire job and focus is to silence anyone like me. Not just me, it's happened to people across the country. I've spoken to people who have been terrified, crying, families, they put pictures of their children up. It's a massive campaign, a funded campaign. There is no free speech.
And your friends in Generation Identity, or the people that you work with, Lauren Southern, Brittany Pettibone, being denied entry to the UK, how do you feel about that?
Well, Lauren's not part of a Generation Identity. To be honest,
she's connected to
I don't agree fully with the identitarian movement. Okay. Yeah, I never have. What this come about was a real matter of free speech. You've stopped a man, you haven't just stopped him. They didn't just hold Martin and Brittany and put them on the next flight back. They tried to punish them the same way they tried to punish me for years. They held them, separated them, put them in a detention centre, put their lives in danger. Majority of the detention centres Muslims. Put their lives in danger to teach them a lesson, to scare them and say, you're not coming in our country. Why?
Is being anti-Islam religious hatred?
No, of course not.
If you hate Islam, is it religious hatred?
No, of course not. No, opposing a religion, it's exactly what I said. Is if I oppose Scientology, no one would say I'm racist or inciting religious.
If you oppose Jewish people, someone would say something about it.
No, Jewish people is different to opposing Judaism. If I picked up the Torah and started saying this says this, I don't think I'd face charges. I don't think I'd face the harassment I'm facing. So it's our God-given right to look at a religion, whether it be Christianity or Islam, and pick flaws of it. It's our God-given right to mock it. That's our right. No one can stop that.
Does an imam have the God-given right to criticise Christianity?
Of course.
And to talk
criticism of religion is very...
Call for the banning of churches and call for the shutdown of churches in different countries.
Of course, in fact, they don't have to call for it because they do it in most countries. Can't build a church in Saudi Arabia.
You regard hate speech as anything that incites violence?
Inciting violence.
If it doesn't incite violence, then...
If I was saying something like all Muslims are bad, we need to... I'd say that oversteps the mark. I've never said that. Not once in my life have I said that. Quite the opposite.
You oppose Islam?
I oppose Islam. Islam's an ideology. Muslims are people. Muslims are innocent adherents and followers of a religion. Yeah? I have a problem with the book, the ideology, the scripture. So they're two separate things. If I was hating a book and hating that scripture because of what it says about gay people, because of what it says about women, if I hate that, that's very different to hating individual people. It's very different. So yeah, I separate it every time. The left seem to have a problem separating Islam and the followers of Islam. I think Muslims are victims of Islam, and I'd love to see them all set free.
Okay. You believe that, and you've obviously read the Quran. A lot of people who follow you, who follow your words, probably haven't. Do you condemn? So on Sunday at Speaker's Corner, there was some footage of a guy who was harassed. Do you condemn any violence by your supporters? Of
course I do. People were shouting down the gentleman, which I saw they were. He wasn't violently attacked. He was shouted down. He was in the middle of 2,500 of my supporters, or more. And as I said, not one person laid a finger on him. But
aggressive behaviour.
There was, and I agree, and it's not right. And in the heated moment, I'd advise anyone, as I always have, against violence. In fact, what people don't like to talk about is when Lee Rigby was killed. In my first speech I gave, which the media never pick up on this. In my first speech I said 600 Muslims are serving in our armed forces. They're doing a lot more for this country than I am. If you spit at a Muslim woman or abuse a Muslim woman, you're an absolute coward. If you attack a mosque, you're a moron. I've said these things continuously for the last 9 years. I've always separated the difference between extremist radical Muslims and ordinary adherents who don't actually follow the religion that way.
Why do you think your message doesn't get across?
Because the media don't want it to get across. They need the bogeyman. They want the bogeyman. They want me to be the hate figure that I'm not, and I never have been. That's why I always say to people, there's not one thing I've ever said that's racist or extreme. I simply point out facts, and these are facts that we should be looking at.
Why have you decided to do it?
Because, as I've said, I see that's the way to reach people. And what I realised very quickly was that we are the media now. So I always say you have the old media, you have the new media. We're the new media. So many more people are watching our videos and listening to us. I'd say I'm probably the most listened to journalist in the UK, and that's not me being big-headed. When I looked at my figures for a 4-week period, 193 million people read my tweets and 49 million people watched my videos just on Facebook. I know 6 million have watched them so far in the last 3 weeks just on YouTube. That's on YouTube. When you combine all this together, the media are dead.
How do you bring about policy change? Because a lot of what you're saying to me is not about what Joe Bloggs should do on the street. It's about how our politicians should act and how things should be changed in that way. What do you want to achieve, and how are you going to achieve it? That's what. It's great to talk about free speech and to say, okay, well, I should be allowed to say that, but what is the consequence of that, and how does that actually be put into action? So
when I first started in 2009, I saw that the only avenue we had and the only option we had was to get out on the street. And do you know what? Before we went out on the street, we tried everything. We contacted our council, we done petitions, they ignored us. We didn't matter because there weren't enough of us. So we went on the street. That gave birth to the English Defence League. That's where I had to be to get the platform to talk to people. I've then thought about politics and done my mind with politics, and my last custodial sentence would prevent me from being able to be an MP. So then I see that the future is this. The future is your phone. The future to talk to people, and they're fully aware of that. We had the advantage in 2016, and governments and tech companies have cottoned on, and now they want to take the power back. I think I looked in the last 7 days, 7 million people have watched my videos just on Facebook. Now, we're reaching people, and they know we are. We're talking to people, and we're changing people's minds and opinions. All the years of slandering and attacking us, and the view they want to give us. What they basically want to do is the media want to write a story about me, and they want me to have no right to reply. That's what they're trying to do. And they also see now that people are listening to us and we're waking them up. The only future option is that, yeah, we need political change. We need political change. I see my position as media. Okay, so give me your manifesto. If you were going to get into politics, if you can bring about political change somehow, what's on your manifesto? I'd close down the 100 Sharia law courts we have operating right now. I'd close them down tomorrow. I'd outlaw Sharia law in the UK. I'd stop all funding from Qatar, Saudi and Iran. I'd stop all Muslim immigration into our country. Temporarily. I'd temporarily stop the building of mosques. Temporarily. Until we get to the root cause of the problem, until we sort out the mess we're already in. There's so much we could do. I'd segregate our prison systems. We'd have, instead of prison systems, I'd have prisoners, they're basically prisoners of war, which is what the radical extremists are. They're at war with our country and they're not going to change. They are, and until that war is over, which as soon as we accept, if our government accepted we was in a war, then the police officer that was killed on Westminster Bridge a year ago today would not have been killed. He was unarmed because it doesn't look nice. Lee Rigby's base, there was no military. Would you arm police officers? Yes, I would, yeah. They need to be armed in the situation we're in. We're at war. Would you have military on the streets of Britain? You need it. At certain times, you need it. Well, the point is that even when Lee Rigby was killed, there was no armed personnel near there. That army barracks is within 5 miles of the biggest Sharia zone in Europe. We're at war. 2,000 young British Muslims went to fight for ISIS. We have 23,000 of them that we know about, and we're watching and monitoring. Do these rules, these things that you bring in, apply solely to Islam? Or if you're going to close down, say, religious schools, does that include Catholic schools? Does that include, or does this if Catholic schools were, if we had undercover documentaries like we have for Islam, and madrasas, showing Catholic schools being told that Muslims are filth and scum and vile and do not even walk on the same side of the road as them. And they're being violently beaten, literally having the Bible beaten into them. I'd support closing them down.
So do we close down the ones which we've seen in documentaries, or do we just close down all of them?
I think every madrasa should be closed down. Any school that is bringing people up on a teachings of a hate-filled book and a violent book, I'd close down. Children need to be free from Islam.
Does that not come back to freedom of speech and the freedom of right to choose your religion? If we start cutting down on...
If Nazism was a religion, that's the equivalent of what we're witnessing. Hitler was a teddy bear compared to Muhammad. He's a teddy bear. So 270 million people have died under Islam. 270 million, not 6 million, 270 million. So once people understand, but we're not allowed to understand because you're not allowed to talk about Muhammad. Because the minute you do, they want to kill you. If we talk about grooming, the sexual exploitation, 90% of the convictions for that, 90% are Muslim men, 20% are called Muhammad. Muslims only represent 4% of this country, 5% of the country at tops.
In the
Why
grand scheme of when you look at that compared to rape committed all around the country,
the majority of paedophiles are white. The majority of paedophiles in the UK are white. The 90% of paedophiles in the UK are white, as you'd expect from a 90% white country. Yeah? What I'm talking about is a complete irregularity in figures. 90% convictions Muslim, 5% of the country's Muslim. We have to ask why. Then when you look at the cases, or you go through and you have in-depth look at the cases, do you know how many victims I've sat with, how many of their parents I've sat with, how many there's a charity called Seek Awareness, I've travelled the UK with them, meeting all these people. This isn't about rape, this isn't about sexual satisfaction for the men that are doing it. This is about destroying those children and girls. It's a lot more. It's when men are sharing young girls with their brothers, with their cousins, with their brother-in-laws. What sort of man sits and shares the rape of a child with his brother-in-law? This is accepted in a whole different way to any other paedophilia or sexual exploitation we've seen. And to stop it, we have to understand it. And to understand it, we have to talk about it. And if I talk about it, if I was to tell you that it says 14 times in the Quran, it explicitly says, outside of your 4 wives, you can take whatever your right arm possesses at war. So they're allowed to take non-Muslim women at war. If you want to listen to Boko Haram, ISIS, any of these groups that are doing exactly the same, what we're seeing is young English girls being taken as sexual slaves, all sanctioned within the Quran, all sanctioned within the scripture.
I think if you said before that you're used as a bogeyman for you know, people who want to say we don't want right-wing opinions, you know, we don't want that. Do you not think in many ways what's happening in Telford, in Rotherham, is being used as a sort of bogeyman situation for anti-Islam, for anti-Muslim sentiment? Because it seems like what's happening there is awful, it's terrible, it should be stamped out, but all paedophilia, all rape, everything should be stamped out, and it feels like the actual number of people you know, that carry out the crimes, the percentages, it's way in the favour of white men. White men are carrying out much more predatory attacks. We haven't seen the government or the police or social services accept that they've ignored white men doing attacks because of cultural sensitivity, or they didn't want to be deemed racist. We've actually seen... So you think it's the response that's actually the issue? Oh, if this was dealt with in the way it should have been 30 years ago, do you know groups have been talking about this for 30 years? Everyone's known this has been going on. When I first started the English Defence League and started talking about these issues, people thought I was mad. I can replay an interview I had with Jeremy Paxman where I tried to tell him. And he said, you expect us to believe that this is happening? We've got young girls, and most people in Britain should know this. A young 11-year-old girl had an iron rod with the letter M heated up and ingrained on her bum because she was the property of Muhammad. Another one of the young girls had her tongue nailed to a table. I've spoke to her father just last week, whose 12-year-old daughter was taken to a park and a canister of petrol pulled over her. If these crimes were happening to Muslim children at the hands of non-Muslim men who were saying they were doing it because they're Muslim, this whole country would burn. And the fact is, our daughters just seem like it's acceptable. I had a cousin who was sexually groomed and raped from a young age. No one's seen her. Our family haven't seen her for 20 years. These girls are taken. That's what's happening. And the proper response is not to call people who identify or try and research and find the problems as racist or extremist or promoting hate. The proper response is to get to the root cause of the problem and deal with it, which we're not. We're still seeing today, I still read a news article today, Asian men. They're not Asian men, okay? They're Pakistani majority. Some of them are from Somalia, some of them from Kurdistan, some of them are from Iraq. The one common denominator, if you want to go to Holland, it's the Moroccans doing it.
If you want to go to Australia, it's the Lebanese doing it. If you want to go to France, it's the Algerians doing it. The common denominator and the common link between all these men who are sharing these young girls as sexual slaves, Islam and their religion. And that's not my fault. I'm just identifying the facts.
Is it my responsibility to protest every time a white man rapes a woman?
No, it's the hypocrisy of it all. If Israel says, if anything to do with Israel, we have millions of Muslims marching everywhere every week if they want to. The hypocrisy that our children are being taken off us, enslaved, raped, pimped, beaten, murdered. One young girl was chopped up and put in as kebab meat in the city of Blackpool. How many people in this country know that? How many people know the names and the lists of these young girls who have gone missing and who are dead? No one. That's the problem. And the problem is, as I've said, if it happened to any Muslim child, then every politician, everyone would be screaming from the rooftops about how disgusting it is, and they'd all be looking at the links to why it's happening. We're not even allowed to research the links to why this is happening without being deemed as hateful. And there's so much else the government should be doing, or could be doing, for hate preachers, for mosques. If we talk about freedom of speech, our schools are managed by Ofsted. So we have an Ofsted system. We need a similar system for mosques. We need to know what they're saying. After the Manchester...
Would you accept it for churches as well then?
I'd accept the same rules for every religious institution in this country, from religious schools to religious buildings. The reality is that 99% of the time, it will be fed back to mosques, that the problems will be coming from mosques.
Do you feel like it's easy to cherry pick the most extreme cases than it is to look at the majority of Muslims?
Oh look, the majority of Muslims are peace-abiding, law-abiding citizens. The majority. That doesn't mean that we should ignore the explosive and dangerous members within the community. And I'm not bothered about offending people's feelings in speaking openly and honestly. If the truth can never become hate speech, and that's what we're doing. We're trying to create people talking openly, honestly, and giving facts as hate speech. What do
you want to achieve, and how are you going to achieve it?
I want to achieve a safe and prosperous Britain to hand down to the next generation.
And how do you do
Which is what our forefathers went and surrendered their lives and died to do. I have 3 young children who are growing up in Luton. We have 35 mosques. The demographical change for the town by 2030, the Bangladeshi and Pakistani communities will increase by 70 to 77%. My government already ignore us because we're white and working class. We do not matter because we don't vote them in anymore. They're voted in by the demographical growth and the organisation from the mosques. I want my children to be recognised. I want a safe future for them. I don't want them to become victims because they're not Muslim. That's what I see. So the only way I see that you do that is by opening up and talking honestly about Islam. Let's talk about Islam. We can't even talk about it. We cannot. Lord Pearson in the House of Lords last week asked the question, can we talk about Islam? He was booed and jeered by all the sneering members of Parliament. Those sneering members of Parliament live in leafy suburbs that are not affected. They don't live where we live. They don't see the hatred we see. At the minute, we have madrasas all across this city that are funded and supported by Saudi Arabia. One of the most extreme, disgusting countries in the world for human rights violations, women oppression, homosexuals oppression, all of these problems. In fact, it's illegal to have a Bible in Saudi Arabia. Yet we're allowing them to build schools. And their books, their Wahhabist, literal interpretations of Islam. So there are many decent Muslims, but that shouldn't stop us from identifying the problem and limiting. We have 100 Sharia law courts in this country. We had the suffragettes, we had women fight for decades for equal rights, and these courts are completely abolishing that. And they should be closed. There's so much that we should be doing.
Do you want to close Sharia courts and close mosques? Is that an aim of yours, to completely eradicate mosques and Sharia courts?
No, my aim would be that I wouldn't close down mosques. I'd stop building mosques. If a mosque, I'd stop building mosques now. Because to be honest, say like if I give Luton where I live, where we have 35 mosques now, there's zero integration. Okay, you go to a town near where I live, Biggleswade, where there's a few Muslims, but they're all dotted around in different areas. They haven't got some Saudi preacher, they haven't got some Wahhabi or Salafist preacher telling them that you can't integrate with non-Muslims. They're just born here as Muslims and they're growing up, and actually they're quite integrated in the small numbers they are. Not in Luton. Not in the towns with the mosques. The mosques and the influence, whoever builds and funds that mosques then influences what interpretation of Islam is spread for it. All the money coming in for the mosques now, Iran, Qatar, Saudi.
How do you police a mosque or a religious institution without impinging on free speech?
Similar to, as I said, if you had an Ofsted style team, and if they need closing down because of hate that's coming out of them, they need closing down. And it's like when I do research, whenever there's an attack, I just do research on the local mosque. And do you know what? Some of the views that I find of people who are talking to them, It's disgusting. And then, but all we hear about is the fact that I'm a hate preacher somehow. It's like, well, what am I saying? What am I saying that makes me a hate preacher?
If I went to a pub on a Friday night and I spoke to a few guys in there, I would hear extreme opinions. I would hear extreme anti-Muslim, anti-Islam, these very extreme opinions, often uneducated opinions. How do we change that if by just saying, okay, we want to close down that opinion and this opinion and police religious institutions, how do we actually positively start to integrate people together? Because yes, there are extreme opinions in mosques, but there are extreme opinions in pubs right now.
Followers of Islam will not integrate into our society.
I think
if they're following the scripture, they're not allowed to.
But many Christian people are also the same. They will refuse to allow a Muslim person to integrate in their society. There is a culture in some communities that are very anti-Muslim and not anti-Islam, anti-Muslim culture.
I'd say the difference between people talking negatively in a pub about Muslims and then a beacon of a community centre openly telling the followers and adherents negative things against non-Muslims is very different. How do you deal with that? I keep saying that they're going to go on to create monsters. By when you stifle free speech, when you stop giving people a platform to talk about these issues, you drive it underground. And right now, I'd say the people of Britain are furious and they're angry and they're scared.
Do you accept that there is a correlation between Western intervention and radicalisation? And could we slow down radicalisation by speaking to politicians and instead of campaigning against citizens, campaigning against politicians who advocate for airstrikes and who continue to bomb the likes of Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan, who support that every time?
I'm against foreign invasion. I think that what happened in Iraq was completely illegal. I think what happened in Afghanistan was illegal. We should not have been in either of their countries, and plenty of innocent Muslims would have died. Yeah? But how people in this land will use that. For example, Nigeria, we're seeing Christians massacred, raped, pillaged, murdered weekly, every single week. No one here is being radicalised through that. No one's being so the constant argument, in fact, that's always used by Islamists and extremist radicals is foreign intervention and foreign policy. Yeah, it ain't going to have helped. But let's not pretend without foreign policy that Islam's not been at war with us for 1400 years. Let's pretend that if we didn't invade those countries, that Muslims as part of their ideology wouldn't be wanting to dominate the world. That's just it's a non-argument. It hasn't helped, and I'm completely against it. And I think Tony Blair should face charges for what he's done. But he's not going to face charges, and he should. And that's why I was so supportive of Donald Trump when he was going for his election, because many people want to drag us into war. They want to drag us into war with Russia now. They're trying to drag us into war with Russia.
Do we not need to protect the 23-year-old women who were gang raped in Libya while we fund the Libyan government with British taxpayer money?
Well, that's why Hillary Clinton should be brought to odds for the destruction of that country by removing Gaddafi. They knew what would happen if they removed him. He was the one man in that region who held power and made sure that this flood that we're now seeing come from Africa into Europe, he was the man that prevented that the whole time. By removing him, they knew this would happen. They knew to think that all of this is a fluke, millions upon millions of young Muslim men coming into Europe. It's orchestrated and organised at the top. We're seeing it. So what I'd say is when you saw 1,000 women sexually assaulted and raped and attacked on New Year's Eve in Cologne, when you look across Europe to see what's happening, when you listen to what's happening in Sweden, when you research it properly and you see the explosions of violence against our women, we need to be protecting them.
What's the difference between 1,000 women being attacked in Sweden and 1,000 women being attacked in Libya? Is it we care because the Swedish are Europeans and we don't care because the women in Libya are African? Where do we draw the line and how do we choose who we support? Because every day women are raped and murdered in Libya.
Okay, if you want to go through any Pew Research or top research policy on men's views in Afghanistan, in any of these, in Sudan, in Somalia, you find that 90%, upwards of 90%, do not believe in rights for women. These are the men we're bringing in. This is who we're bringing into our country. 95% of them believe that you should be killed if you leave Islam. How is bringing these people into our country, How do you think? How do they think this is going to work? What we're seeing is just simply what we all know was going to happen. Or anyone.
How about if they're Christian? Does it make a difference?
It makes a massive difference because their views are different, because they're not being brought up. They're not reading the Quran, which tells them they can beat their wife. They're not reading the Quran that tells them women are worth 50% less than a man. They're not reading these views as Christians. So that's why we haven't seen mass Christians blowing things up or raping women when they've come into Europe. When in general, we've seen. And this is the problem. We should be putting who's most persecuted. Many Christians are being murdered and killed on their way to Europe with these groups. We've seen them being thrown off boats on the way to Italy because they were Christian. And then these same people are then granted asylum. These same people we're bringing into our countries. And they're killing people because they're Christian, and then we're bringing them in.
In 2017, there was 172,000 arrivals from the Med. How many of those committed a crime? What percentage of those?
The fact is we don't know. That's the problem. We have no idea. How many of them are murderers, how many of them are rapists, how many of them are terrorists? We simply don't know. What we do know is that 4 of those people went on to blow up, massacre and bomb people in Paris. We know that if you read again what they've done in the Bataclan Theatre.
They didn't come via the Med though, they came via land routes, didn't they, the Paris attackers. If we specifically keep it to, because I'm interested in migration and where you stand and what the solution is. I want to know what your solution is.
My solution would be...
filter it between Christian and Muslim people?
We simply should not be taking in anybody in this country. That's how I feel. We should be protecting them. We should be helping them.
How do we do that?
Well, exactly how we are. We're the biggest funders already now. Britain is the biggest funders to helping refugees. That's how we are. But we find out so many times that these refugee camps are controlled by extremist factions, by terrorists. Many of the people who are coming, as you said, we don't know. So do you roll a dice? Do you do that with your safety? You lock your door at night when you go to bed, don't you? But we don't lock our borders. We let anybody in who we don't know who they are. We don't know what crimes they've committed.
If we did know who they are, and if we were to set up, say like they did with the Lost Boys of Sudan in Kenya, where they set up places where they can legally go through and they are checked, and it's not unchecked migration, it's checked migration, and then they are safely brought over.
None of them should be brought over. None of them should be brought over. Because why? We have 52 Islamic countries. We have Saudi Arabia, one of the richest countries in the world. None of them are taking any in. And do you know why they say? Because of their security. They say that. The Muslim nations won't accept them because of their own security. But yet we're supposed to. When we see 5% of this country is currently Muslim, and look at the problems we face.